A little bit about today. This is our second fall symposium. Last fall we conducted one called the City After the Economy, which, apropos the downturn then seemed like an interesting discussion. This year we're turning to something entitled Other New Urbanisms. It's a very simple proposition for discussion this afternoon, and it's this. It's that about 15 years ago, my teacher, Orhan, said that if there was to be any urbanism, it would not be based on the twin fantasies of order and omnipotence, but on the staging of uncertainty. To survive the continued urbanism will have to imagine a new newness. So 15 years out, what we're interested in looking at is the concept of a new newness. This is certainly not intended today to be a discourse for or against new urbanism officially, but we're certainly curious about other means of inserting architecture and architects into making of cities. In about the sort of intervening decade and a half, while the collective weight of the world's largest cities has grown by almost 150 million people, urban designers and architects have remarkably ceded the planning and invention of cities to a panoply of other interest groups and professionals. One call to action, many urbanists and architects who remain committed to the arena of city making now retreat to historical models of urbanization in favor of innovation or novelty. So that's the supposition. We really want to look today at the possibilities and pitfalls of innovation in relationship to city making. Is it possible or even necessary for architects to engage cities? We may hear today views that would suggest otherwise. But also, can we broaden the discussion of the new in new urbanism with the hope of perhaps looking at contemporary approaches to urban design and architecture that integrate new attitudes towards cultural production, aesthetics, and ecology? So what I'll do now is I'll just hand it over to Dave if you want to say a few things and introduce our guests.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Peter. And again, this is our second of our annual fall public events, and we intend to announce a second spring competition shortly once all of the terms are worked out. And also to those of you in the audience who may be prospective students who are interested in the program, the SCI-FI, the Future Initiatives, SCI-FI and SCI-Arc program is a one-year Master's in Design Research. It's a 3-semester sequence, and both Peter and I will be here at the book launch after the conversation and happy to talk with you about how the program is structured, opportunities that you might have for participating as it moves forward. So today we have 3 presenters, and I'll introduce them in alphabetical order, and then also 2 respondents or discussants, whom I will also introduce in alphabetical order. First we have Dan Fletcher, who is the principal at Fletcher Studios and is faculty at California College for the Arts in San Francisco. I should point out that David was a permeated entrant in our competition last year on new infrastructure. We try and make sure that there is a connection between everybody, that we keep running through some continuity through the program. David is an urban designer and landscape architect. He's taught at GSD at Harvard, SCI-Arc, and Otis, where he was the assistant chair of architecture. His research and writings address infrastructure, ecology, landscape urbanism. His practice ranges from strategic site design to regional planning, with an emphasis on performance and process. Fletcher Studio has been named finalist and winner of a number of recent international open space design and planning competitions. Current and recent work includes alternative transportation networks, green streets, public parks, reclamation projects, and waterfronts. We also have Mia Lehrer here, and Mia hopefully will be a participant with the program as a discussant as we look at North American urban river systems next term with the students in the Olin studio. Mia's work is extremely well known for her work at the Los Angeles River, and some of which I believe she'll be presenting work that she's done in that context today. Mia is the founding principal of Mia Lehrer & Associates, known for its design and development of a wide spectrum of ambitious public and private projects that include urban revitalization developments, large parks, complicated commercial projects, with a focus on the Southern California region. Mia prides herself on her firm on reaching out to the community, focusing on projects which affect neighborhoods. She's also committed to protecting our environment, designing projects that heal our earth. She's an environmentalist in heart and in practice, which is quite an accomplishment. Lehrer has forged a reputation for excellence in landscape architecture that has attracted work internationally. She believes that great landscape design coupled with sustainability has the power to enhance the livability and quality of life in our cities. Our third presenter today is Andrew Zago, and his connection to our program was that he was the leader of our second semester studio last year's SCI-Arc program, a future initiatives program, where we were looking at Detroit. He is the principal of Zagreb Architecture, and he is on the faculty, and he's the visual studies coordinator at SCI-Arc. Andrew Zago formed Zagreb Architecture in 1992. He worked in Los Angeles and New York, where he was the founding director of the master's program in architecture at the City University of New York. Aside from his architectural projects, he also creates autonomous studies, mostly in the form of drawings and assemblages. While still completing buildings, he's currently experimenting with film and digital processing to explore urban and spatial analysis within the context of Detroit, which is his native city. Following on from these presentations, we'll have some comments on two respondents. Orhan Ayyüce is the architect and senior editor, architecture critic for ArchiNet here in Los Angeles. He's also the columnist for Architectura in Istanbul. He's born in Izmir, Turkey, but he lives and works in Los Angeles, and he is a graduate of SCI-Arc in 1981. The articles, reviews, and interviews that he publishes are regularly seen in leading architecture websites, magazines, newspapers, design blogs throughout the world, and are translated into multiple different languages. Along with his writing and architectural practice, he is a part-time faculty member at Cal Poly Pomona in the architecture department and regularly interacts with students as a guest critic at many of our local architecture schools here in Southern California and beyond. Finally, our last respondent is Sylvia Lavin, who is the chair and PhD in architecture, the architecture program at UCLA. She's a professor of architectural history and theory at UCLA. She's a professor and director of the critical studies and the MA and PhD programs at UCLA. Lavin has served as a visiting professor at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and elsewhere. Lavin's next books, Flash in the Pan and Other Forms of Architectural Contemporaneity and Kissing Architecture are forthcoming. With High C, a design research collaborative she founded at UCLA, Lavin is currently curating two exhibitions. One, Craig Hodgett's Playmaker, which recently opened at Ace Galleries in Los Angeles, and I actually encourage you all to see it. It's quite an interesting show. And Take Notes, which opens at the CAA, the Canadian Center for Architecture, in Montreal in February 2010. So with that, I'd like to invite the panel to come up and we can begin our discussion.
We'll just go one at a time, and then we'll come up. Yeah. So David, let's get you going. Thank you, David. And we're on David Fletcher Studio.
Thank you very much, David and Peter. I just want to make sure that the laser pointer is set on stun. Maybe I'm not sure I can do laser pointing microphone and advancing at the same time. Is there a stand or something we can use? Thank you very much again. I think we have about 20 to 30 minutes or so I'll try to move along pretty quickly. But we basically, our studio now has, coming off of about, in 6 months, we did 6 competitions and then 3 exhibitions. We've got major kind of competition hangover. But basically in our office, we do real build projects, but also try to have a competition in our exhibition we're working on simultaneously all the time. And so we use them to explore different aspects of basically as research projects. So really are much more excited about ideas competitions than anything. And so some of the things we've been looking at are Los Angeles kind of Post Everything, which was applied to the new infrastructures competition. Urban, say, I can read the book, but living infrastructures, urban agriculture, metabolic habitation, and urban metabolism and global warming. Some of the issues that we've been looking at. I'd like to look today to two things. One is an exhibition that's now in UT Toronto that Mason White curated called TerraBank, and then a competition that we placed second in here at SCI-Arc. And in order to kind of set the stage for that, I want to look at some mapping that's really kind of the result of a lot of layers of mapping that was collected while I was the project manager with me and Lehrer's office on the Los Angeles River Master Plan. And so this is an image of 4 counties, of all the roads, and the watershed boundary, which we'll continually see in most of the mapping and projects, is drawn in orange. You see the roads within the watershed boundary, the highways, and it's really a measure of the extent of urbanization and sprawl within the city. By comparison, this is an image of the watershed boundary and all of the rivers to date. Santa Clara River, Los Angeles River, which you see here, San Diego River, which joins the LA River. I became very fascinated early on with boundaries. Wrote an article for ACTAR in Infrastructural City, book edited by Kaziz Bernalis recently, and was fascinated by the LA River especially. It's a river that moves through about 14 boundaries, has different maintenance jurisdictions. You could be standing in the middle of it underneath a bridge and your feet are in water that's owned by the city of Los Angeles. You're in a right-of-way that's maintained by the county within space that's controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. You might have, for example, Burlington Northern tracks going on your left, the Southern Pacific tracks going on your right, and your head is within the air rights of Caltrans. And so, again, kind of invisible jurisdictional boundaries and boundaries of power that start to multiply when we zoom in. Became pretty amazing area of discovery for us. Another is transportation and movement through the city. What this is a map showing in orange all of the rail networks, in red all of the street highway networks, and in white the streets. This map is actually a composite of about 5 different maps. Coast Guard 1904 maps, Coast, USGS maps, some maps that Jessica Hall put together with the grant for Northeast trees, and then those are all kind of superimposed to get an understanding of what Los Angeles used to be like and what the watershed boundaries and how it sort of changed and deposited and made incredibly fertile soils throughout LA. And then the engineered solution. This is basically our watershed. Today is a complex operational landscape that would flood every time it rains, if not for the choreography of different basins that collect water and are strategically released at times. It's a fully engineered system that has perhaps 3 different kind of riparian or green zones of different kind of infrastructural ecologies which are expressing themselves within the city. And what I became really fascinated with is our relationship to waste, our relationship to water. What this is, it's a superimposition of the watershed boundary and the sewerage boundary. And it shows the different water treatment plants that are throughout the basin. Basically, all of our water goes into the ocean. And although there is one plant that's going to start to pump water down into the tertiary treated wastewater down into the aquifer, there's a lot of political resistance in what is called toilet to tap controversy. So about 87, on average, million gallons are lost to the ocean every day. But 80% of that is from us flushing our toilets and washing our cars, which is pretty fascinating. And it started to occur to me that the LA River is really kind of more river if the metric or kind of determining definition of river is based on water. It's more river today than it really was. And so when you superimpose all of these infrastructures, you start to understand or see what we call later kind of an armature potential for a new city to emerge that might respond to the challenges of or today's global challenges, which I'll get to. If we look at one aspect, of recent, we've had a lot of water main breaks happen in the city. They've been well publicized. One of them consumed a old fire engine in Lehrer. And so a lot of this is how we're dealing with our policies of water, but there's an aging infrastructure that loses about 15% of the total water just in transmission on any given day, which is actually quite a good number in comparison to other cities. The civil engineering, American Civil Engineering Society gave LA a D- in infrastructure in general. And so we submitted a proposal or submitted an exhibit for competition new infrastructures, which was really focused on transportation at the time. And once we started to really look at the city and given the kind of more holistic way that, or at least the data that was available to me, I couldn't just look at transportation. And so we looked at really all the infrastructures combined, and then we tried to answer a few questions. One is we're in a time of peak everything. I don't have to do kind of an Al Gore number here, but basically peak water, peak oil, and arrows kind of show our position, peak food. So right now, the Green Revolution has allowed us to keep up with this white line, which is global demand for food. And we've broken from that recently, quite dramatically. And so this is our position on that graph now. Precious minerals, pretty much everything you look at is in short supply, dwindling supply. And so the assumption then for this competition was, what would LA be like in 100 years or so with no imported water, no imported energy, no imported food, etc. And then how would these infrastructures and new infrastructures relate to each other and react to each other? So what you're seeing is the full board that we presented in the competition, the key of which is these kind of temporal mappings. And I'll try my best to explain them. And a timeline of assumptions. So each one of these is about a 25-year interval. And then this is a cataloging of what we're assuming along the way. And I'll spare you from learning or from hearing all of those. But the three kind of main constructs, which are sectional, are focus, which would include kind of primary habitation, potentially energy generation, solar chimney towers, vertical agriculture, and also bundled infrastructure. So the best of our existing infrastructure is going to determine agriculture, which we'll talk about. And then that gives rise to potentially a new more vertical and dense city. So that's focus. Fuzz is the area perhaps in the ocean and in the periphery, near the fringe, which is defined by mountains. So fuzz is in areas of operative landscapes. Could be areas of biomass production, mining, solid waste processing, habitat areas, dryland agriculture, algal fields, solar and wind energy production, and then aquaculture, wave energy generation, etc. So we're pretty much growing every technology we can and just trying to save this city. Transportation, waste, water, and energy are a part of this kind of flow construct. And so we began, I should mention these were generously given to us by David and myself in this Oblivion series, which are about 15,000 foot photographs of Los Angeles that are magnificent. And we created an index that would measure in red dependence upon imported water. So this is our current state today at T naught. Ecological footprint, comparative measure, our own sort of native supplies of water. Population, roughly 10 million. And this is again kind of aggregate of these systems. We can see kind of the debris basins that catch debris, our existing water system, and our sewage system, everything kind of overlaid. And so the first kinds of assumptions, and maybe I'll just read through this first one and I'll spare you the rest of them. But state high-speed rail construction would be one of the first steps. State water conflicts result in a 48% reduction in imported water. 70% energy imports, so reduction in energy imports. Primary desalination plants come online, 0.5 meter sea level rise. National high-speed rail network begins construction, and offshore aquaculture zones established, as well as wave energy generation. So wave energy platforms happening here. The city is in a sense receding, that it's way too expensive and unrealistic to kind of live way out in the periphery in the suburbs, and people are moving out of the city. Okay, so there's a reduction in population and a reduction of the ecological footprint by virtue of reduction in imports. Then you have this primary kind of armature that's based on existing infrastructure and where they align and where they can be augmented, and in a mining or inversion or evisceration of the city. High-speed rail, 48% less imported water. National high-speed rail beginning there. So then you also have the establishment of what we're calling these kind of primary nodes. You start to see here. So as an image on the left, David's images of kind of maybe Santa Monica-ish area, downtown LA with Taylor Yard, and then the valley. And so what you're seeing with these star patterns is a process of microbial inoculation. So we're thinking blimps or some other kind of science fiction distributor with distribute and rain spores on existing suburban fabric, existing buildings, and allow it to be mined. This is something that's happening in Detroit, it's happening in many other cities today, where cities are selling to salvage team a lot of their existing infrastructure. And we're kind of embracing this concept that we would literally mine the streets and mine the existing periphery. An establishment of reservoir systems, so the tactical kind of fungal deployments that are occurring at these eventual secondary nodes, reduction in imported water, etc. And these kind of infrastructural tentacles reaching out and then beginning to reach down to Central America. And then kind of a closure of some of these zones and loops. And the establishment of agriculture along the Los Angeles River path, and the establishment of a new kind of delta, let's call it. And so the age of spores is kind of related to the previous, but this is really the establishment of these kind of secondary nodes, which you start to see here with operative landscapes, and you see the armature kind of growing large reservoirs, surface reservoirs and underground reservoirs, and the connection of these kind of primary nodes to these secondary nodes. And then the growth of the green stuff, which is basically performative, potentially agricultural biomass energy production landscapes. Reservoirs are both surface and underwater. They're just basically blue symbolic. And then kind of the definition and closure of these zones, and more kind of tentacles reaching out, high-speed rail to the US down to South America and up the coast. And then the final manifestation, or maybe the penultimate manifestation where the system is growing. And what we're measuring is a reduction in population, let's say at this point down to about 5 million people or so, but then the reindustrialization of the core. And the city is in a sense succeeding as a port city, basically, what it is now, of about maybe 4 million or 3.5 million very happy, hardworking people. And And so here you can see, again, the section through the city and the kind of resource management. One of the things I didn't mention was that all waste, all urine, all everything is all reused within the city. Biomass is spread into fields and vertical agriculture and the kind of stinky urbanism. And then use horizontal space for productive landscapes. What you're seeing below as well is through this larger section, transect, and then what I won't go into, but what is an exploration of different modes of transportation that reach out into the city. And so this is also a measure of how this would be happening simultaneously in many other city centers, and that it would reach out and be kind of a new network that forms both nationally and globally. So the second project that I'd like to talk about was an exhibition for Hydro City, as I mentioned. And it's research that we did. We asked ourselves, what would the first kind of increment be in this sort of habitation of the space? Where would it be in its most inexpensive and perhaps realizable form? So we were looking basically at three different things. One is the rise in homelessness across the nation, especially in Los Angeles, which is basically the capital of homelessness for the nation. We looked at kind of understanding that in terms of demographics, both nationally, locally, and then also spatially within the city where people who don't have kind of stable habitation live. We're also pretty fascinated by foreclosure phenomenon. And there's two things you should never look at on the internet. One is where the child molesters are, because they're everywhere, and the second is where the foreclosures are, because they're everywhere. And it would be interesting, I think, to map both of those, but it's a pretty frightening statistic. And so both that phenomenon within Los Angeles, but also where you have large kind of linear, let's call them bailed housing developments that run out of money, run out of traction with materials for the city. So one idea was that we could actually mine some of these developments or mine them for surplus materials to create some form of modular habitation. Where would this exist? We challenged ourselves with looking at some of the most difficult spaces. One of the ones we were fascinated by are the trapezoidal kind of sunken freeways in Los Angeles. And so we mapped those locations, which I think when we calculated it totaled something like almost 4,000 or 4,200 acres or so. And then superimpose that on the map of encampments and facilities for the homeless. And ask ourselves, what other potentials do these kinds of spaces have? So we felt that they could become spaces that are highly productive for a temporary habitation. That they could do all the things potentially that we're listing in text. And so the project was called TerraBank, and it's basically right along the freeway systems, a modular community of units that serve two occupants that would emerge on the embankments of the freeway with a causeway behind, and then a hexagrid system of productive landscapes and a water cleansing system, which I'll talk about. And so, as usual, we became very interested in how these things work as systems. So one was that we could capture water from the constant drip of urban runoff that goes underneath the freeways, because that's what the stormwater mains are. Intercept that into cisterns, intercept runoff and from other surfaces, and then use a kind of living machine or terrace weapon system to cleanse that. And so that's what this image is meant to show. But then also have a policy where each dwelling has 500 gallons per week for the two-person use, or at least a limited supply, and then everything else is shared facilities. A whole array of productive landscapes that could possibly inhabit these spaces. And administrative services, job and vocational training. What we're thinking about it is as what we're calling SHO, kind of a single harvest occupancy system, where you could be there for one harvest, and then you could apply based on good behavior to be there for two. So what we're showing here are this kind of system of wetland terraces that would be pumped by solar pumps. Water stored and energy created in the roofs, which I'll talk about in a second. And then a notion about productive landscapes. Our fantasy was that this would be a small vineyard, or potentially the entire thing could be a vineyard. We thought about how it might emerge through time. So looking at a system of soil creation, causeway establishment, phytoremediation and bioremediation of the existing polluted soil. And that would occur then here in the second phase. We had the establishment and building of a hexagrid circulation system, and the stockpiling and generation of new soil for landscapes, the establishment of water quality system, and administrative pioneer programs, almost a successive kind of emergence here. And then we would think the success of the system would emerge through time. And the terra bungalows that we were designing are these two-story units with roll-up doors in the front. Have their own kind of energy generation solar panels, capturing water and having, as I mentioned, a fixed water supply, 2 pumps, and then a lift workspace that's pretty tiny, so it's about 350 square feet total, the whole thing. And the fantasy is that it would work, capture water and sun, and work as kind of a reciprocal metabolism of the landscape. One of the things we're showing here is this kind of causeway, and potentially like market stalls or farmers market, these can open up into that zone. And we're thinking that this thing is going to just absolutely take off and go viral. And so we got pretty excited about it as potentially a system along the Los Angeles River that could take inundation. Obviously, it should be at the base of the Hollywood sign. And we even kind of got excited about designing the wine model, which is a 10-year Syrah. And so with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, our next presentation will be going to be a Lehrer.
If David is thinking a few decades out, today I'm going to share what sort of we see as some tactical solution for the next hopefully decade. So as you all graduate from this program, you can start injecting yourself in the process of change in Los Angeles or the city that you choose. And so I want to share some of the sort of strategies that are sort of layered and immersive, but tactical, that we are involved with in a series of projects in the office. So, urbanism as landscape and some of the interventions that we're involved with. I'll share with you a little bit of the LA River project and how we see that project becoming really a series of really major changes in terms of the city and the city fabric, and creating a whole new set of solutions in terms of neighborhood making and environmental strategies. And the deployment of mobile agriculture, and then building community, whether it's Hollywood Park or Jordan Downs. So this being the LA River, we're somewhere in this general area. We've been working both on Baldwin Hills, Hollywood Park, and Jordan Downs, and actually with your professor, David Bergman, on the TOD in East LA. David shared some of the background and really important aspects of reconceptualizing how the LA River operates. It's a fantastic piece of infrastructure. It's very efficient, takes water up and down 52 miles in no time. It clearly basically cut the city in half. It operated as a real gash, as a barrier between communities. It was an economic barrier, social barrier, cultural barrier. It has the opportunity of reversing its fortune completely and really becoming an integrator of communities and connecting them and redirecting development. So it's an economic engine in the making. And as we saw the river, and we were part of a large interdisciplinary team, it was a project that was run by the Bureau of Engineering, with actually civil engineers running and managing the project. It was an 18-month process, which looked at not only the river, but open space networks, and the urban network, and a lot of the opportunities for new development along the river. So we are down in this area in industrial, reconceptualizing of this industrial zone, live work, connecting east and west, as well as many other communities that have an opportunity of reinventing themselves. And certainly densification is part of it. But as part of this process, it was a process of education. And I think that as we move forward in urbanism and try to figure out sort of our strategies, it's about educating not only the public about choices and opportunities, but also the elected officials and the bureaucrats. And when we, clearly green infrastructure is something we're all very used to at this point, and we know what the pressures are on sort of the environment, but educating and really sharing the information so that as the agencies are making decisions and we're moving projects forward, that they understand what they're making decisions on. As a result of this project, which was adopted by the City Council, a river unit was formed within both the Planning Department and the Bureau of Engineering. And both those departments now run a really strong-willed and very forward-thinking series of planning efforts, and they actually have a series of guidelines. And their big success was that the first two projects that came through for approval for construction along the Ojai River were actually rejected because they did not meet the guidelines that had been set forth about water quality issues, about urban fabric, how to deal with alternative modes of transportation, and how to deal with all the issues that turn it into positive and change and new kind of thinking about urban development in the city. And here is the idea that all these changes need to happen in a phased and strategic approach, and the importance of this important network to start getting creative, where you're connecting schools and you're connecting existing parks and churches to the river, and that it starts sort of this incredible network starts really strengthening the city fabric and starts recognizing the river as a piece of infrastructure that actually exists and that starts creating this level of organization and community making. So, and then of course the river that we all know and love, and then the river and what it can be. And certainly these kinds of photomontages or types of photomontages that really allow both a level of education, both at the community level, but also at an agency level, and then certainly in terms of elected officials, the notion that one can change the infrastructure and really start understanding it in a new way. It's really important. I don't know if one of my students in here, but I taught at Harvard last year, a studio in Baldwin Hills, and this is a project that actually had in my office and vision plan was adopted by the state about 7 years ago. Baldwin Hills Oil Park, remaking this industrial landscape and remediating contaminated sites is clearly part of our lexicon of projects in landscape architecture, landscape planning. And repurposing the land. How do we repurpose 1,400 acres? 1,400 acres is bigger than Central Park. It's bigger than Golden Gate Park. And it's a huge piece of property in the middle of our city, and a stone's throw away from the office of culinary professors here. And amazing, most of us love what this looks like, but most of us also understand that consolidation and also new types of mechanisms to extract oil exist. And that there's an opportunity to actually start rethinking about what this site is and what it means to the community around it and to the basin at large. One of the things we looked at was how do you basically consolidate the oil and want to coexist with the oil, because politically that's what you have to do. And I remind you, this property is 60% in private hands. These are people that for generations have been living off of a monthly sort of allowance that allows them to be retired regardless. And therefore very unwilling to sell the property, even though if they were to want to redevelop as a group, they would have a very hard time because it's actually zoned agricultural. But in a sense, when you see the clutter there, you see the inequity, 800 of the wells that you see, and as in love as you might be with that equipment, that marvelous equipment, 800 of those vertical elements are literally inactive and just sitting there because. So the opportunity of starting to think of this as one of the islands in our city, and we think of Griffith Park and the Condon State Park and the Elysian Park, and how we have to start thinking about how our city actually maximizes and takes advantage of some of these large pieces of land that actually can become a lung in our city, that can actually start dealing with some of the raw nerves and needs that exist in our city in terms of health, not only physical, personal health, in the major, but also in terms of the quality of life issues related to pollution and other things. And so we looked at the benefits of a park, the fact that clean air and community health and the regional income and tourism are all have a value, and that the recreational space and urban forests and park construction and oil fields and energy farming, all these amenities have a value, and that we needed to start looking at the cost benefit of these large pieces of infrastructure that can be repurposed. And what are the advantages? Everything from green jobs and tourism and real estate and all those benefits that we can basically capture in these 1,400 acres. And that for every dollar spent on the creation of Baldwin Hills Park, it would generate $1.27 to the economy and benefits. And again, the costs and the benefits, which obviously the benefits weigh the cost of building this park, and actually the notion that you can start really using solar infrastructure and even the consolidation of the oil field, which now becomes a park, in part owned by the parkland and used in order to pay maintenance and operations for the site. And so the opportunity of creating a park, it actually is a project that's on its way. It's not a dream. The question is when. There is a whole series of, a conservancy now exists. The Baldwin Hills Conservancy has been operating for the last 7 years. They get usually about $40 to $50 million a year to purchase land, and they're working strategically to actually try to amass the land, and our study actually helped them understand also from a geologic and oil production perspective where and how they could consolidate the activity in the oil production and how they could start phasing the park construction. Hollywood Park, well, a casino and a horse racing track that is going to be part of the Inglewood community and become a new kind of community. Basically, it's no longer economical to run or have these racetracks all over the country, so everything is usually done digitally this is going to get dismantled as of next year. It's in the middle of Inglewood, as I said, 238 acres, an amazing opportunity to really sort of stitch the city together. Beautiful residential area, the Forum up in here, and really an opportunity for this underserved sort of community for new residential development and new options and choices development. The notion that obviously a new network of sustainable infrastructure, we're capturing water, we're working on all the elements that would turn it into sort of an interesting, desirable community. 25 acres of parkland have been dedicated, which is a significant amount of parkland. It's not a gated community, and it's a project that's actually going to start construction mid of 2010. And what this actually, the lake, which is an irrigation, a lake that actually captures water and then services the irrigation on all the parklands. This was built in the 1940s, a pretty harsh environment and a place where the Bloods and the Crips were actually birthed. Gang territory, very, very rough. And again, only a stone, actually about 5 miles away from Hollywood Park. And it's a Cohoe 6 project. It's one of the federal funding, federally funded projects. It's going from 700 units to 1,400 units. Again, the notion of involving the community, really working with the community to help them understand the process of change, phasing, and what the opportunities there are. The Housing Authority bought this giant industrial piece of site. This is where the Figueroa Corridor is, and the 110 Freeway is right over here. It's actually serviced very nicely by the Blue Line. And I think one of the main things we wanted to share on this project is also making it through the specific plan is we've been working on a community, basically community serving agriculture and trying to find a way to be incredibly tactical but also realistic and aggressive about how and the community is going to get integrated into sort of a program that allows them to use the agriculture commercially, but also start benefiting from growing their own food and vegetables. And making sure that, of course, the architecture allows for roof gardens and all the other kinds of sort of urbanistically, whether it's setbacks for community gardens, front porch agriculture, and other aspects of the program, which include a large community garden. And then next is Farm on the Wheels, who participated in a small competition that celebrated the 30-year anniversary of farmers markets. And as we sat around as a team, one of the things that we realized it's not so much. We could, of course, consider redesigning what the tents look like and how everything gets stored. But what really struck us in our work in East LA and certainly in Jordan Downs is that the distribution of food is really inequitable. and that operating, that way, we were actually benefiting certain segments of the population with fresh food and obviously not others, but also cost. The cost of the food is actually not in any way monitored, and that we wanted to find a way of delivering fresh food in an equitable way across the city. And, obviously local food is going mainstream, and there is a food policy task force that the mayors now put in place, and there is a big effort and a tremendous amount of interest among citizens and elected officials to try to really further the agenda. And we realized that, started looking about, how much land is in farms within the area of LA County, what size the average farm is, and sort of the total value of these crops that are produced, and started looking at strategies for how food and food distribution would happen within the county area. And so the notion that actually for the competition, that the food would the food would come from the agricultural field to a hub, and in the hub there would be refrigeration and storage, and there would also be an open market and food stalls on one end, but that farmers would deliver their food and then go back home and do what they like to do most cases, which is to actually farm. And that there would be a new crop of people and jobs that would allow people to go and deliver food to a community of their choice. And so if you would actually load the truck with more types of potatoes than you were the one working in West Hollywood, then you would probably deliver more types of mangoes and tropical fruits in East LA. And that you would actually have 3 of these hubs. One hub actually capturing the food coming from the north, the food coming from the east, the agricultural areas, and one coming from the San Diego area. That you would actually start deploying these farm trucks and delivering fresh food to all these people. And the people would get to know the community and get to know what people really needed. And as I understand it, and I didn't grow up in America, but in California there used to be library trucks in the 1960s, and so there was this notion of sort of the community building that happens through food and buying of food. And there was all sorts of ideas on how this could happen, including they could probably put your order online and go to this school when you were picking up your kids and actually pick up your bag of fresh vegetables. I know that when this image came out, everybody thought it was just about the green truck, but it's about much more than the green truck. And Mr. Lehrer really did buy the apple on our truck. But I think that as we think of the larger scale issues in Los Angeles, whether we're thinking about recalibrating urban biodiversity. And we're actually working on a project where we've started looking at sort of the patches and networks and mosaics that relate to an area of the city that will become potentially a laboratory for a campus, the residential. This is the industrial urban sort of typology. The campus typology, and then the network, freeway and arterial typology. And as we think of those elements, we start thinking about what is growing there now, what could be growing there, and how do we start creating pedestrian scale, or how do we re-emphasize and reinforce what exists. And we know that we can never go back to the original ecological sort of framework of and typology of this area. So what is, in fact, our new typology? So this happens to be one of my pet peeves because, as you all know, it's now illegal to plant palms in Los Angeles. And both from the perspective of in terms of urban ecology, which is an existing framework that also gives us culturally a very important sort of framework, and one that really deals with the skyline of Los Angeles, the emotional relationship to the sky, to the mountains, and to the streets that are really important and give scale to communities. And in the end, it's about repurposing. This is Silver Lake, repurposing our infrastructure. It was a drinking water reservoir. It is not going to be, as of 2015, no any longer a drinking water reservoir. As we work with our elected officials, and it took us about 5 years to actually build a 2.5-mile sidewalk along Silver Lake when we still thought it was going to be a drinking water reservoir. So my hope is that there will be many of you who will participate in the process, and that these fences can come down, and that these communities who accept this piece of infrastructure as their viewshed can actually start considering it part of the public realm. And that we all need to make sort of a paradigm shift about what is public and what is private. And it's not just about me and my family, but it's about us and the rest of the Angelinos.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, our final presentation is by Andrew Zago.
First, I want to just talk about the SCI-Fi program just for a second, because I had the great experience of teaching a studio within it last year. And I just want to say that I think David and Peter have really been doing some remarkable things over the last year to sort of revitalize what had been, I think, honestly at that point, a nearly dead program, and have brought in a number of the issues and people that they've brought into the studios actually are quite not the sort of default settings, and not a lot of the typical alternatives that you see within an urban program like this. So I say that by way of saying the program's great, and I preface as a way of prefacing saying I have absolutely no idea what the conference is about. So I'm gonna and perhaps that's the brilliance of it. We'll find out, but. There's a couple of things, I don't really, and this was also the I suppose the thrust of the studio that I taught, and actually Sylvia was on our final review, was it is on, and it's an interesting, maybe an interesting discussion relative to the SCI-Arc. I really, I guess it's a question of relationship of architecture to infrastructure. I mean, architecture to urbanism, which to my mind exists largely as a very large question mark, more than anything that I would have a specific answer to. And also thinking in terms of my own work, I don't engage in urban projects, certainly not at the kind of scale of the things we've seen there. The closest thing I've done to that is probably some of the issues around the city of Detroit, but I've decided I'm taking at least a 1-year moratorium on talking about Detroit, at least until Time Magazine stops their daily blogs from there, and the New York Times stops their weekly horror stories from the city. But even then, it's not urbanism at that scale. And I guess the question is always, especially given an environment when for a whole series of reasons, practical as well as, I suppose, conceptual, it is not possible to unilaterally hoist a specific master plan over large swaths of the city and say it shall be like that. Or if it is, those things don't have the kind of, at least in American context, the kind of traction we would expect from architecture. The question is, what really does an architect have to give to urbanism, and the only answer I can come up with is architecture, which is to say, for lack of a more sophisticated way of putting it, I suppose the specificity of form and the specificity of space, whatever attribute that may lend to a city, and it's very difficult to prove that it has much valiance compared to things like policy and planning, let's say, which has very direct, measurable sort of effects. The problem, of course, is always that the link between that and the specificity of architecture that these kinds of efforts can produce is often extremely problematic, I would say. And so I always, not saying it isn't a problem that one should grapple with, but let's say it's not central to my practice. So looking at the conference and what it was supposed to be, this is my interpretation of it, which I'm sure is exactly what you wanted, which is let's look at something that would be the closest to a kind of urban question, but not. See, I thought this would be a conference among colleagues and friends rather than presentations to the public in general. So I literally thought, well, maybe I can sort of take something off the desk that's in progress and show it as a kind of sketch that this might be of interest or might raise some questions rather than really. So I'm actually not going to present the project, and I'm not saying this by way of apology, but just by way of explanation. I'm not going to show a project. I'm going to show a small feature within the urban landscape and a few words about it, and maybe that would be, maybe it has some relevance. It would be, giving it like the 40th anniversary of Sesame Street, and one of these things is not like the other. So this is going to be, it would not show up on any map. Just as a kind of, a couple of background things to show. It really has to do with, I suppose, trying to find if there's some, in urbanism, or in particular, more specifically, let's say urban ground, urban surface, if it's possible to teach sort of an old dog new tricks. In other words, if there can be some sort of way in which one can deal, thinking through some of the topological inventions that have, and innovations that have sort of been seen in architecture in recent decades, whether one could think of a kind of urban and in particular a kind of ground condition that could benefit from that. And so as a kind of precursor to that, briefly showing a couple of projects in which they're urban projects, and in all of them there's an effort to bring in not only a kind of urban space within a project, but actually the corporeal substance of the exterior of a building or the exterior of an urban experience into a project. I would say, quite frankly, in a kind of at a sort of formal level. So again, I'll go through the projects would be a lengthier presentation, but just to show sort of one feature of them. This is a competition from a couple of years ago, which was for the extension to the Stockholm Library, the famous Stockholm Library. This is, of course, the extension here. But in this project, and this was, they were dealing with, in that previous slide was an example of that, I guess hovering around the twin concerns of, or the twin fascinations maybe, with human contortionism on one hand, and then the idea of involution, or something sort of growing back in on itself as ways of dealing with sort of peculiar topologies. And this is sort of a proto-version of that, but in this ridge here with the observatory at the top was the end of a glacial ridge that used to run through Stockholm like this, and had been leveled off and replaced with some other buildings here. And then you have this, especially in the Stockholm winters, this sort of dark canyon of the street here. And so the thought was that the main reading room, which necessarily would have to be your obsession in designing something next to the iconic Asplund reading room, was instead of being this feature that's isolated from the city, would actually be as if a section of this urban space sucked down into the city. You can see it here. That you would just bring the main reading room as if that space came in and then crashed back out into the city here, a kind of herniated condition. And this would be sort of looking back into it. So this would be the main reading room, would be more like, say, hanging out on the steps of the Avery Library at Columbia, rather than sitting in a kind of fixed space. And then down on the street below, it sort of permeates out through the building skin and gives you a view of the top. And then another competition, this was for a museum of contemporary art and planning in Shenzhen, China. Again, the competition that I know a lot of my colleagues have done as well. And here as well, there was an idea of, more specifically, I won't disturb you with too many photographs of human contortionists this afternoon. But this was looking in particular at the famous Tatro, a contortionist who appeared in one of the Pee Wee Herman movies, actually. But this was actually the idea of a building itself coming back and becoming, in a sense, its own interiority, or at least bringing the urban space back within itself. And so there was a certain kind of ambiguous moment where this is actually a cantilever. It comes back like a kind of ram's horn back in between its own legs, and it makes, in that way, sort of elevated public space here, and another one here. You can see it here in section, these two spaces. And so this was the Museum of Contemporary Art. Below these planning exhibition centers, you may know these from Beijing and Shanghai. They want one too. It's the real spectacular piece of it is an enormous model of the city, including showing future planning for the city. That gigantic model is here. You have a sort of glassy plaza, and then the underbelly of this involuted cantilever is gilt with gold leaf. And so you have this thing between the city and a kind of suspended golden sky where you see the back through it. And then the last one, and this is also where I'll show a small detail of this project as the main point I want to show, but this was for a competition from just this summer. My students who are here know it because we're working on this ourselves, and this is the National Museum of Polish History in Warsaw. This is this existing castle. I'll talk more about the urbanism of it in a minute, but this is the museum here. And this is taking that idea, not only literally of the involution, not only like a contortionist where a figure will double back in on itself to make a new figure, holding some of that exterior space. This is the logo from Fastlight, the clothing company. But with the exception, there's a little hole right there. With that exception, this idea that the exterior actually comes back and pierces back through the skin and comes back there and it's programmed to the eyeball. And then also it takes that thing that comes back and involutes, this gets back to the question of the sectional object, is not simply a continuation of the skin, but takes on its own figurality as the other key to that. And you see it happening here, and this figure coming in, a kind of redo of the Warsaw's Black Madonna, I guess. One that comes in and forms a sort of entry condition, then another one from the entry that involutes back up and leads you into the main exhibition space. This is the main entry floor here. It's a little dark to see it, but this is that large looming object that you walk into and around as you go through it. We'll talk about Sylvia, like a very large version of the whale in the Natural History Museum in New York, and the second one that serves as the main gallery and exhibition space. So you see it again. Now, this is this freeway that comes through, but I'll talk about that in a second. So this is the setup, I guess, and this is Warsaw, at least as it was in 1897. But what you're looking at here is the planning that goes back to 18th century, possibly a little earlier. But it's obviously a kind of Baroque axial planning strategies applied to the historic core of the city is further up here. So this is a kind of outgrowth of it. One thing I wanted to say, this was talking with David Fletcher about this before. This is a map by William Lindley. I don't know if any of you know William Lindley. I didn't know him either. They just had a big show on his work in Hamburg and like the 150th anniversary of his birth. He's a British civil engineer, and he's considered basically the father of modern urban infrastructure. In particular, I guess, infrastructure of hygiene. In fact, mostly he completely did the sewer and water systems for 30 cities across Europe, including Warsaw. Most famously Hamburg, I guess at some point Hamburg had a large fire, and he came in and there was like statues to him all over the city. That was fascinating. I just came across it and I thought I'll mention it since we're in the news urbanism. Here is the site. So when I was showing you that building, it's sitting right here. Next to to it here is this castle, which in various iterations had sort of buildings. There's a kind of big archway in this building. There was a church sitting here. The other major feature here is this escarpment that works its way down here. It follows the Vistula River, which is here, and this formed one part, kind of almost a natural defense to the city. But not only that, with the old town and the original castle here, and a series of important buildings follow this escarpment, there was this panoramic view that you would see from the river that really defines the city of Warsaw. All of these important buildings, like a string of pearl along there, and then when it ties back into the city, it's done through all of these Baroque axes. So you really have these two lines here. In particular, because here if you look at this castle, which is now a contemporary art center, this line coming through and then the line of I'm really going to show like a sketch here, so I'm not going to, the graphics aren't going to get fancier than this. Now this is sort of what's interesting, this is in the 70s, you have a certain kind of idea of urbanism and the arrangement of matter and plant life according to these axes and the vistas that it provides. And this is sort of, Soviet era planning here, where they decided to cut a freeway both across, you see it here, this is that axis. And here they're just digging it out. They incise a trench, and so you can see this in terms of a lot of, say, late 20th century strategies, or even earlier 20th century strategies of defilement and transgression, I guess, even though in this case by a series of Polish traffic engineers. But nonetheless, there is, willfully or not, it slices across not only this axis that connected across here and down the escarpment, but also cuts into the escarpment itself. And so this was seen by the competition organizers very much as a kind of violation and a defilement of what makes their city great. And here you see that, which actually it's not so bad to me, but it is not my beloved city. There you see the castle. This is sort of interesting, which is also what makes you wonder. It's hard to tell here. All you see here is the kind of footprint, the ruins of the castle, because in the 50s they decided to just tear it down. And in the 70s they both did this and decided to build it again from scratch. So this is actually, circa 1975. And there's that thing coming through. And this is my project for it. You all know, of course, this is the, pardon my French, Gustave Caillebotte, the Paris on a Rainy Day, 1877. And I started thinking about something else. This is three different diagrams that I had not three different diagrams. Three illustrations that I just put together for an essay I just finished for Perspecta on the awkward. The awkward is a certain kind of emerging sensibility. And at one point I talked about it relative to urbanism. And I give this first example of, let's say, the flaneur, which is to say the urban, and all three are Parisian examples. But the urban man or the urban woman that defines, that both move in accordance with the axial geometries of the city and depend on the formality and arrangement of that kind of space for a sense of their own propriety, let's say. And so the two reinforce each other, and they depend on the propriety and coherence of the urban form for a certain sense of themselves. As opposed to the tresseur, I believe, pardon my French, practicing the art of the parkour. I was told these are not called parkours. Parkour is what they do, they're actually called tresseurs. And this, of course, this is the sort of, if one would be, let's say, the postmodernist ideal of a reconstruction of a certain kind of urban order, this would be decidedly the deconstructivist move, which is to say that they're, these are an art form, an athletic display that originated in the housing projects of Paris, on the outskirts of Paris. And here, they're actually working not free form, but explicitly contrary to the intended arrangement of the architecture. In other words, they're doing it in such a way that it draws a kind of critique of the, an exposure of the, what would you call it, the systems of control and oppression that are inherent in this kind of architecture, and this exposes it and sits in counterpoint to it. And then I propose number 3, which is Pierre Antoine, in front of the Bibliothèque Nationale, noted French contortionist. I'm just going to mention here, by the way, I wanted this picture for the article, and my office contacted him, and he wrote back and he said, "Yes, I've spoken to my friends in America, and we understand you are a very serious architect, and so we'll give you permission." So I thought, among contortionists, I'm irate. You're sympathetic to our cause. And I saw, what's interesting here is, this is, you know, the feet are on the steps, but this is no longer about working in accordance with the system, nor is it about being a critical counterpoint to it. It is merely that system, and yet somehow swerves off of it into some other kind of territory of pure error. Like there's no way you can actually move, and it actually suggests, well, the city actually has to do something different. This is not about working with or working against the existing city. You actually have to do something else with that city. This is a very big build-up to, this is my project. This is a very big build-up to a small feature, but it relates to that, just as a device, let's say. So of course, so it goes with cities. One of the great models for the kind of arrangements that they were suggesting in Warsaw. This is of course Versailles, and then of course, if you thought of the freeway cut as being a sort of engineer's maybe unconscious version of another Parisian park that we know, Lavin, with its lines and cuts and overlays. Or, you know, our project, I would distinguish it as well, let's say, from of course, this is an early axonometric of the Yokohama Pier. Here, so what I love is the ground not only is a deformed surface, and in this case it does become, it does sort of topological tricks in that, number 1, it is transplanted, of course, from the ground to a pier, and number 2, it becomes inhabitable. But we're thinking, this is sort of the problem then, with the competition. There was a portion of it that you needed to do something with that urban plan. Now, the road, the path to, I won't go back, you'll recall it when I describe it. From that axis to where that castle is, it's been slashed across by the freeway. At the same time, on top of what is the freeway is our new project, and the overwhelming desire on the part of the city and the competition organizers is that you make it whole again. And so then faced with these two things of, do we just reconnect that line or do we not reconnect that line? It seemed as if we would be stuck in that problem of the flaneur or the traceur. And so I thought, instead of a chain link fence, which is, interesting to my mind, you think of a chain link fence as a grid, and a grid. So if you think of a grid as a kind of urban cladding or linear condition, in a chain link fence, it is nominally a grid, but when you actually look at it, not only is there a three-dimensionality to it necessarily in order for it to work, but that no part of it actually aligns with the grid. Does that make sense? In other words, the line would be connecting that node to that node to that node. The material is offset from that. So if you were to put, probably from here to here to here, if you put together a grid like that, it's all working around it without ever actually instantiating that particular grid. And so as a man trying to think of that as a topological picture, funny picture of Central Park that I'm suddenly realizing I needed one. The things you find on Google. So I was thinking, is it possible to imagine that? Certainly one could imagine that as a kind of building condition or a three-dimensional condition. But if you think of most of these urban strategies, what both the, let's say the Schumi and the Versailles, for lack of a more sensible comparison. What they have in common is a certain treatment of a surface. If there's some way you can think of the surface as a certain kind of topological piece. And so what you see here is a lot of you I'm sure have experienced it, which is that you can largely go north-south in Central Park and have very little sense of these traverse roads simply because of how they're separated at grade. A minor thing, and of course the kind of American example where you can actually take a surface and bring it back in on itself, and at various points it is simply a surface inscription, and at other points it becomes an object. So what we did was this is the project simply to take a model like the chain link fence, but to measure it geometrically so that it works in certain axial ways as the pre-existing axis works, except at each point where it ought to connect, it doesn't. And instead it passes back through itself. And so in most cases it's a surface, so you have these kinds of conditions. In most cases it's a surface, but then exactly where you ought to be able to continue on with it, it in fact raises itself up as an object and perverts that ability to connect through when you actually are suddenly going in the other direction. So it's a kind of three-dimensional ha-ha. Everyone knows ha-has, don't they? So it just is a plan. So there's a kind of chain link fence at each one of these. You can see here, again, just a very quick study, but you have a series of conditions here where these are simply paths on a warped ground surface, and then you hit these nodes where a different thing happens. There's the museum, there's this. So what you have is, looking at it again, from that center to here, you have, as a broken line, this series of things going across there, right? 3 segments, but since they're not flat, perspectively you see it as one, sort of one line. And then going to this one, you have a series of staggered perspectives going to it. And so this would be this one, going from here. If a sort of Baroque axis would give you this, like at Versailles, the ones in the museum instead goes like this, except unlike the yellow brick road, when you go down and continue, you suddenly find yourself over here and not continue with it. And in fact, to continue what you have, so this is the only slide I'll show of the trident, okay? The so-called desire lines, that suddenly there's a whole other thing. In order to get where you want to go, you have to go off the path and start messing up the landscape. That's the idea. So this would be it. The other one, that zigzags across. And a couple of 3D. Thank you.